Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session today regarding data and integration. My name is Jamie Piers. I run the business development for a business called SYNATIC. In a nutshell, what we do is we make data and integration easy. So what we do is we allow ourselves to integrate solutions around APIs, SDKs, ODBC, and flat files. So in short, what it allows us to do is to move data simply between solutions. In our current world, obviously there's a lot of data floating around. So we deal with this plethora of data floating through the industry and floating through our businesses that is generated and delivered out of many different solutions. And what we end up having is we end up having fit for purpose solutions in specific areas of our business that we then need to bring data together, as well as bring data into each of those systems from their respective systems. If we don't feed these systems, ultimately what ends up happening is we end up in a world where we don't have a single view of our business and we don't have a consolidated understanding of our business. So this isn't limited to a discussion around business intelligence, but obviously business intelligence and AI come into the discussion here. So we're talking both about integrating systems between systems as well as out of systems into a consolidated business intelligence play. So we bandy about these cool phrases like democratization of data and everyone to get access to that data. But ultimately, what ends up happening is we need to consolidate those different data sets. And what does that really mean in the real world? So how do we achieve this democratization of data? And we often talk about getting the right information to the right person at the right time. And that's not only in terms of a business intelligence play, but it's also a simple example like moving an account from a CRM solution into an ERP, or moving a lead from a lead generation system into a CRM so that we can then manicure that lead and look after that lead in the CRM, progress them through the process and output that lead into an ERP or into a portfolio management solution if you're in the insurance world. So there's a lot of different ways that data can be moved. So one of our mottos is progress now. So we talk about progressing the data integration quickly, talk about progressing it now, and we talk about moving that data rapidly so that we don't end up in this situation where we've got multiple systems with multiple sets of data. So one of the concepts we're very passionate about is incremental change is the compound interest of innovation. So when we look at the concept of innovation, and innovation is a continual drive in businesses per se, innovation doesn't happen overnight. We don't go from yesterday to today and have a brand new idea and have that implemented in our business overnight. What happens is, at very least, it takes several weeks, and very often it takes several months to reinvent and innovate both our services and our supply. And that innovation process allows us to understand our business more and to start looking at how we can reinvent and do things better. So what we look at and we're passionate about is that incremental change. So it's about saying we can progress change now in incremental phases and then get to a better position with our integration lifecycle at the end of that. So our platform allows you to access data right away. It allows you to integrate data right away. And critically with our platform is it reduces delivery time and costs significantly. So it's by up to 80%, sometimes it's 60%, sometimes it's 50%. Most of the time it's sitting around somewhere between 70 and 80%. So when you're looking at your timelines of a typical integration project, you're looking at somewhere between 3 months and often up to 18 months if you're in an enterprise play. So what ends up happening with that strategy of taking a big chunk of time to go and deliver integration is very often it doesn't facilitate innovation, first of all. And second of all, what it does is the business needs have changed by the time we actually deliver the integration project. So if you look at an integration project taking 3 months, very often, even in that medium-term time frame of 3 months, the actual business requirements have changed as we've moved along. Also, what we provide critically as a solution is we allow staff to focus on their core systems and capabilities. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is thinking as opposed to doing. So a simple example is very often we're using Excel, a heck of a lot of Excel to move data out of systems, to report on data out of systems, to manipulate data between systems. What ends up happening there is we're doing, not thinking. So what that means is the staff aren't having that headspace to go and consider how to do things better, how to innovate, how to reinvent what they're doing. And we are a core strategy, and what we enable is the ability to create space for staff to actually focus on their core jobs and their core systems, as opposed to having to do this job of manipulating data and moving data between solutions. So who are we as Synatic? We're a South African business, born and bred, developed out of sunny Johannesburg. We're an 8-man team at the moment, and we're growing out rapidly into a 20-man team by the end of the year. Essentially what we are is we're a hybridization between ETL, ESB, and iPaaS. So meaning what we can do is we look at moving 1 million records at once and transforming that data as we move it, or one record 1 million times. So taking transactional data and moving it into another solution. So what do I mean by that? I mean transactional data, we're looking at things like invoices. So how do we get an invoice out of, for instance, Salesforce and move that into Acumatica? Or how do we take data out of Salesforce's SOCL call, which is their ability to go and query bulk data at the same time, and go and move that in, transform that data and move it into a BI solution like a SQL database, like a Postgres database, like a MySQL database, et cetera, et cetera. And critically, what we do is we allow you to do that at a rapid pace and at a reduced cost. So our platform and our 3 core tenets are nimble, simple, powerful. So nimble, moving rapidly with those business requirements as the business requirements come in. Simple, we solve those complex data issues and data requirements in a simple platform. And then we don't compromise on the enterprise grade features. So what that means is that you get an enterprise grade solution at a decent price, and it really does provide you that ability to move and integrate data quickly and rapidly. So what I've done here is I've brought in just a typical kind of insurance layout of what we do with insurance organizations. We all deal with insurance organizations at some point in time. So we've all either been on the customer side of that, and some of us may have been in the actual businesses of insurance. So effectively what we do and we look at in an insurance world is we look at many solutions fulfilling different areas of our business. So very often we've got a lead generation system like HubSpot. We've got a CRM system like Acumatica CRM, or we may have Dynamics CRM. We may have Salesforce. We've got a customer engagement center. So there we've got a call center system like Avaya. We've got an ERP sitting there like Dynamics F&O, Dynamics BC, Acumatica, Sage 200. And then we've got risk factors, so things like AccuWeather, where we need to go and bring down a notification around a hailstorm that's coming in, and then we've got a policy management solution which holds our insurance policy data about what Jamie has, for instance, for my insurance. So be it life insurance, short-term insurance, car insurance, etc., etc. So they are a very classic example of a best of breed versus single stack solution, where you've got a best of breed solution in each of these areas, fulfilling each of these steps, but there's very little in the way of integrating those together. And so ultimately what we do there is we go and make it possible for you to integrate those multiple systems to each other. Thereby what we do is we allow you to do things like personalizing service. So if our CRM system is integrated to our policy management system, what I can do is I can very easily generate marketing communication on a personalized basis because I know exactly what policy a person has. So if I know a Ford Ranger insured with me, I can go and offer him other services around that Ford Ranger. So let's say I want to go and offer him a dent and scratch repair service. I can very easily know what car Jamie has from the policy management system in my CRM and automatically generate a bulk email from my CRM pertaining to Jamie's specific needs, because I know the value of his car, I know what type of car he has, and I know that he will likely have the ability to afford a solution like that. So that is the kind of concept where we start integrating those sets of data. So we do things like CRM to ERP. So when an account is converted in CRM, we can push that account into the ERP. And critically, what we're doing, as I said earlier, is replacing those manual, heavy logistic processes of moving data between solutions. And then there's the good old Excel. So I love Excel, for clarity. I don't have an issue with it, but when it comes to integration and moving data between solutions, Excel really actually just becomes a bit of a nightmare, because the same statement of Excel holds true for both its greatest power and its greatest weakness, which is you can do anything in Excel. So you could do anything in Excel, which is awesome. It means that you can manipulate your data, you can change your data, you can work with your data, you can do anything with Excel, which means it sucks from a point of view of trying to push that data down into another system, because different people can do cells differently, they can do calculations differently. These 10 little fingers at the end of our hands can make mistakes. And all of a sudden we end up in a position where either the Excel file doesn't flow into the solution properly, or it's outputting the data incorrectly, or it's using something simple like scientific notation on a specific field. So there are powerful bits of Excel, but there's some real detractions from using Excel as an integration engine. And then obviously we get the analytics and AI enablement through that. So AI is something that is very topical at the moment, but again, it's a very difficult thing to articulate. So how do you articulate AI? Because yes, it's awesome. There's a whole bunch of solutions and cool concepts about what we can do once we've got all that data pieced together. But ultimately, to get that data from the source systems to that AI enablement platform is the biggest trick, because once we've got the data into our consolidated BI or AI database, we can do anything with it theoretically, but how do we get the data there? And with this multitude of stacks of solutions we have nowadays, where we go right from an old archaic AS400 solution and need to pull data from AS400, but then we've got newfangled modern solutions like which have got your RESTful API endpoints. How are we going and bringing this data together so that we have a cohesive singular data strategy for the business? So this is just a diagram around the sorts of things we start integrating. So obviously with our partnership with About IT, we're talking specifically about Sage 200 and Acumatica here. We're talking about CRM solutions like Salesforce, Dynamic CRM, Sugar CRM, Pipedrive. We're talking about lead solutions like HubSpot, SharpSpring, Lead IQ. There's quite a whack of them in that space. Warehouse management solutions like Granite, and then obviously notifications like Slack and Teams, and then via Synatic, which is this pick in the middle, that's our icon, we can then go and take that data into analytics, AI, and machine learning. So that at a very simple level is what we do, is we are fundamentally the glue between multiple systems, and we make it easy for you to move data between these different solutions, either via ODBC. So typically when we're pushing to analytics, we're looking at an ODBC connection, and we're looking at pushing into the likes of SQL, as I said, Postgres, MySQL. And then when it comes to something like Salesforce or HubSpot, we're using their RESTful API. Great. So benefits of SYNATIC'S platform solutions. So I'm not going to run through all of these because personally I hate it when somebody reads a PowerPoint back to me, because I can read a PowerPoint. So the overriding sense here is that there's a bunch of good reasons to head with a data integration platform versus bespoke writing of code surrounding integration. So some of the fundamental reasons are you get a quicker time to delivery, you get it at a reduced capex cost up front, and critically it's maintainable. So roughly around about 50% of actually building an integration is writing data between systems. 50% of it is actually supporting and maintaining it after you've delivered it. And people often forget that the energy and effort in supporting an integration strategy is just as important as actually delivering the code up front. So it's all well and good to go with a code-based integration, and ultimately that's what we replace. But the problem is that the next step of that is we have to then go and maintain that code. We then need to go and write that code so it is orchestrated between the multiple solutions we need to connect to. So yes, it's easy in inverted commas to write data directly from, let's say, Salesforce into Evolution or into Sage 200. So that is doable. It's a little bit of hard work and a little bit of legwork because Sage 200 has an SDK as opposed to an API, but it's perfectly doable. The problem comes in is when you need to start orchestrating that data between, let's say, Salesforce, HubSpot, Granite, and Sage 200. So all of a sudden that world of complexity around orchestrating and automating that data flow between your multiple solutions actually becomes quite tricky. And then you're entering into several hundreds of, if not up to 1 million or over 1 million rands worth of development surrounding that integration. So it does become trickier as we head down that road. So part and parcel of our solution is the ease with which we can support it after implementation. We've got several strategies around error management and error handling. Do we reset the export batch? Do we reset the export of a specific sales invoice? Do we go and put it into an error management platform in SYNATIC'S so that a user can log in from outside the system and then can go and fix the data before they try to reprocess it straight in SYNATIC? So there's multiple strategies around that, and almost always that's a bespoke kind of solution around how you need to handle error management. So it gets quite user specific or case specific, as it were. Cool. So let's show a little bit of SYNATIC and what we do. I'm going to pop open my SYNATIC screen here. So here we've got a very simple flow of data where we're going and moving data out of Salesforce, and we're going and bringing that into a parallel flow here moving that data into a CSV dump of those accounts. We're also going and pushing it into Acumatica, and then I'm going to get to this flow at the bottom here. So the flexibility of Synatic is that, say for instance, we wanted to conditionally process data based on this flow structure. So what we can do is we can fetch from Salesforce, and then instead of having a parallel flow, we could drag and drop a condition on here. What that condition would allow us to do is to say, if the customer is a customer that is a retail customer, follow the top subflow. If the customer is an FMCG customer, follow the middle subflow. What we also do here is we allow for series flows. So series goes and runs those flows stepwise. So it'll go and run the subflows 1, 2, 3. The reason why we do that is because of that orchestration concept. So being able to simply move data as we go through each step, we can put in time delays on it and orchestrate those flows so that the data flows properly and in a timeous fashion. And then what we can also do is we can do for each loops, which basically what it'll do is it'll take each item here and then loop through the flow and subflows every time we've got a new record coming through. So in this example, what I've done is I've connected up to a Salesforce test account, and very simply what I'm doing is I'm bringing through a current set of records of just the customer ID and the customer name. So nothing fancy, very simple, and obviously I can bring through addresses and et cetera, I just kept it nice and simple for the demo purposes so that we didn't have a complicated item to run through. And then what I'm doing is I'm taking this data set and I'm pushing that data set in parallel down each of these flows. So the idea here is what I'm doing is I'm going and doing a calculation, which is just basically where you have a need to write your own code into Synatic. So it's an important clarification. What we can do with code with data as it comes into Synatic is we can go and write our own JavaScript into the application. So very simply here, I've got input record equals input record, but I can actually go and write my own JavaScript into the solution. Should I have more complicated flows to write or more complicated transformations on the data required, I then go and run a sort step here where I sort on that ID field. So that's just to order my data out. And then I push that into CSV. So the combine step is combining the data back down from a JSON script into a tabular format, and then I'm pushing that data out to CSV. In the next step of the flow, or in the next subflow at least, what I'm doing is I'm mapping up the file of data. So instead of it being ID and name, I'm simply mapping that to account ID and account name. So all I'm doing here is I'm effectively taking these field names and changing the field name to account ID and account name. So it's a pretty simple step. If I go and click play here again, you'll see that what I'm doing is instead of it being an ID and name, I now have account ID and account name. So it's a nice simple way to manipulate that data and make sure that it matches up to the destination that I'm sending to. In the same way here, I'm going pushing it out to Excel and then writing the data into Acumatica. So in Acumatica, what I can do is I can hook up to an Acumatica API. So we're fully compliant with either Acumatica on-prem or Acumatica in the cloud. We're then going and hitting the customer entity and inserting data into that customer entity. So it's a nice simple way for us to manage the creation of accounts from Salesforce into Acumatica. Fully aware that Acumatica has its own CRM solution, so this may not be pertinent, but at the same time, there is just the reality that some customers will still choose Salesforce CRM and Acumatica as the ERP and WMS. On the last flow here, what I wanted to show you is how easy it is to bring data into a SQL server. So what I've got here is I'm taking, again, this exact same data set. I'm going and grouping by customer name. And then what I can do is, if, say, for instance, I wanted to go and push this into a destination of SQL Server, I can go and drag and drop SQL Server onto my connection here. I can then select a SQL Server that I've got a connection to, and I can then go and say it's same kind of concept, pop in customer. I can do column mappings if the data needs to be mapped to that SQL object, and then I can push the data into SQL. So that is literally how simple it is for us to push data into a SQL Server table. So what I can do as well is I can do updates, upserts, and then I can literally run a stored proc with that data, and I can do a command here where I can actually go and write update customers set, etc., etc. And I can go and write my stock standard transact SQL into the SQL command space there. So our flexibility is the beauty of the solution ultimately, is whether you are working with flat file, whether you are working with an API endpoint, or whether you ultimately need to write the data into a BI solution and into a SQL table base or any transact SQL type solution. So we also work with Oracle, we work with AS400, we work with DB2. So any of those solutions, ultimately, we can go and move that data in and out of various solutions. Right at the end here, what we do is we have our log recorder. So what that log recorder does is it records necessary items as they come through this flow. So what we do here is we catch errors, and then we can obviously catch things like completed, skipped, headers, footers, etc., etc. But typically, we find that a customer is looking for the error management there. Once that error is logged in the system, we can then push a notification to Slack to say, hey, you've got an error, you need to go and manage that error. Or alternatively, we can go and roll back. So there's multiple ways to go and handle an error on that basis. So other bits of functionality we offer. So I'm going to talk a little bit through these. So what we do with down at the bottom here is what we call a relay. So what a relay is it's the ability to connect to an on-prem solution from the cloud. So a relay is a little exe that you install behind the firewall on which the on-prem solution is located. So on whose network the on-prem solution is located. So say, for instance, we are working with Sage 200, which is almost always on-prem, or in fact, it's an installed app. So it either has to be on-prem or it has to be in a private cloud. We need to connect up to Sage 200. What we do is we put the relay behind the firewall in the same network environment in which 200 is installed. And that relay then brokers the connection between Sage 200 and Synatic in the cloud. And the way it brokers that is there's only ever a call out via the firewall. There's never an inward bound connection via the firewall. So what that relay does is it calls out to pull data down from Synatic and push it into Sage 200. And it fetches data from Sage 200 and calls out to push data up to Synatic and onto whatever cloud-based solution Synatic is connecting to. So the idea there is that we don't need to go through a process of creating an SSL certificate. We don't need to put an HTTP address in. We don't need to open up a port on the firewall. And what that means is intrinsically, the structure of the solution is much, 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 much more secure. So, and even on top of that, there is the requisite encryption and protection of your data between the relay and Synatic. So we don't ever want to open up the firewall because it creates security risk. Inherently, it creates security risk irrelevant of how much security you put on that port on the firewall and put on the SSL certificate. It still inherently does create a level of risk. we can mitigate that risk, but the fact remains that there is a risk factor there. So what we do is we avoid that risk by utilizing relays. Also, what we have is a function called buffers. What buffers do is they're in-memory storage of data. So instead of, when we're moving data between solutions, instead of needing to push data into a temp table in SQL and define that temp table when we only need the data temporarily within Synatic, or when we're looking at mapping of data between two solutions, what we do is we include a step called a buffer. So you'll see I've got a test buffer here. So effectively what a buffer allows me to do is to push data into a buffer once I'm flowing that data through Synatic. So here you'll see that I can go and select that self-same test buffer, and I can then go and elect to insert that data into the buffer as I'm working through this flow of data. So that the examples of using that would be, let's say for instance, we wanted to store our customer master file that comes in from Salesforce, and I'll keep on using Salesforce here, so that I can refer to Salesforce when I bring an invoice in from Salesforce. And instead of having to call back to the Salesforce API and use up another API call and use up time to go and fetch the customers from Salesforce, what I do is I hold that in Synatic. So that means that I can refer to that customer immediately within Synatic and then transfer that sales invoice into Sage 200. So as opposed to having to create more time in that integration, because ultimately, as awesome as APIs are, they do take time. So if you think about a user sitting on their, let's say, mobile phone, they've converted a quote in Salesforce to an invoice, they've approved the invoice, and that invoice does a call out to go and push the data into Sage 200, and then the user is sitting there waiting for those API calls to happen. We obviously want to make that interaction as efficient as possible so that the user has as little wait time as possible. It's also just simply more efficient because solutions like Salesforce have a limit of 100,000 API calls per day. So the more API calls you use up, the more chance you've got of hitting that daily cap. Lastly, what I'd like to touch on is our ability to actually be an API layer. So what we do is we allow you to build out APIs through Synatic. And what I mean by that is fundamentally we can take any source of data and build an API endpoint upon that source of data. So whether that source of data is a buffer sitting within Synatic, so it's that in-memory storage of data, or whether that data is a flow of data coming from, let's say, a SQL server, I can go and create an API endpoint on top of that. So a very real example is we can build an API on top of Sage 200's customer table so that we have an API endpoint to access the 200 table in SQL for customers versus having to go direct to SQL and write data in and out of SQL. So what we can do with this is, and I'll show you our OData build out here. So what we've got is we've got an OData location here, odata.synatic.com/demo. If I click into a specific entity that I've got an OData call on top of, you'll see that I've now got accounts sitting up there. And ultimately what that's doing is it's sourcing data from file processing demo buffer accounts, which is one of my other solutions here, which is file processing demo buffers accounts. So effectively what it's doing is it's taking this buffer of information, this in-memory storage of data in Synatic, and exposing that as an OData endpoint. So where is that useful? So let's say, for instance, we've moved Sage 200 into a hosted cloud environment, so private cloud environment, and we still want to be able to access Sage 200's data through an Excel file dump because our CFO has built out all of his complicated month-end reporting and all beautifully laid out in his Excel sheet. But the problem is that now with us moving into the cloud, we can't get direct access to that SQL call anymore. So you can't just connect the Excel sheet onto an ODBC source from SQL. We now have to go via the web to get back to that database located in our hosted cloud. So simply what we do is we pop an OData endpoint on top of the various tables that he's pulling data from. We redirect those sheets in Excel that he's pulling data from to an OData call directly from the Sage 200 solution, and we pull that data via the web safely and securely. So we're not sending raw SQL data over the web, which is a monstrous no-no. And we then go and fetch that data down via OData, populate our CFO's Excel sheet, happy CFO. So that's the kind of concepts we can start doing with our API builder here, which makes it incredibly powerful to provide those sets of data in those circumstances. What we can also do there is we can go and build out complicated sourcing of data into an API endpoint. So say, for instance, we needed to go fetch customers, invoices, inner join line items on the data set from Evolution again. We can go and create that view of data in a flow in Synatic and then just strap an API endpoint on top of that. And again, our CFO can go through that same process, hook up his Excel sheet to that OData call, pull the data down, and Bob's your uncle. We've got our data in Excel, and all of his beautiful pivot graphs and pivot tables now work as they were working in the first place before we migrated to cloud. So it is a cloud enablement tool, and it's a real sales enablement tool and a real distinguishing factor in a business, because it means that we can really go and start exploring this world of data and this world of cohesively playing with multiple systems in our framework. So that's a brief demo of what we do as Synatic. So we'd love to hear any questions from you. We have partnered with About IT. They're one of our valuable partners in terms of rolling out Synatic to the customer base. We've got a connector for Sage 200 and a connector for Acumatica. So those are both in play. And we'd love to hear back from you. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to hit up your nearest About IT account manager or sales rep, and we will quite gladly present to you and take you through what we do.